In one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, deep in the remote ice fields of Greenland, something impossible began to surface, something buried, frozen, and forgotten for over 8 decades. A World War II-era P-38 Lightning fighter jet, entombed beneath nearly 300 feet of compacted glacial ice, was finally uncovered after 83 long years of silence. But it wasn't just the aircraft itself that stopped the recovery team cold. It was what they discovered sealed inside a chilling, perfectly preserved time capsule that no one expected to find. What began as a routine search mission for a long-lost plane quickly turned into one of the most haunting and emotionally charged recoveries in modern aviation history. The moment the recovery team broke through the final wall of solid ice and caught sight of the aircraft, they knew they were looking at something that defied both time and logic. A machine built for war, believed to have been destroyed by the elements, had waited under the ice, untouched by the chaos of the modern world. And inside there were remnants not just of machinery, but of humanity. Personal artifacts, flight gear, notes, a sealed pack of rations, and something even more unsettling, objects that hinted the pilot may have returned to the aircraft after the crash. Some team members would later say it felt less like a discovery, and more like opening a tomb that wasn't meant to be disturbed. To understand what really happened, we have to go back to the summer of 1942. The world was at war, and the United States was ramping up its efforts to supply the European theater with fresh aircraft and trained pilots. As part of Operation Bolero, a massive logistical operation was launched to ferry hundreds of military planes from America to Europe. One critical path, nicknamed the Snowball Route, ran from Maine to Newfoundland, over Greenland, through Iceland, and finally to the UK on July 15, 1942. A group of 6 P-38 Lightning fighters and 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from Presque Isle Army Airfield in Maine, bound for Iceland with a scheduled refueling stop in Greenland. These weren't just planes, they were mechanical marvels of their time, fast, heavily armed, and operated by some of the best young pilots in the world. But midway through their journey, the formation ran straight into a vicious Arctic storm. Visibility dropped to zero. Ice began forming on wings. Communication was spotty at best, and fuel levels plummeted. With no clear skies in sight and no hope of reaching the next base, the order was given to land on the Greenland ice sheet. One by one, the pilots executed textbook belly landings across a desolate glacier. Miraculously, all 25 airmen survived. They were eventually rescued and returned to base. But the planes they were left behind, slowly swallowed by snow, then ice, then history. For decades, the 8 aircraft later dubbed the Lost Squadron remained unaccounted for. It was assumed they were crushed beyond recognition or scattered in pieces by shifting glaciers. But something strange happened in the early 1980s. A group of aviation enthusiasts and military historians began pushing a theory that at least some of the aircraft could still exist intact deep below the ice. After studying glacial movement, radar scans, and historical flight logs, they concluded that the planes hadn't been destroyed. They had moved slowly, methodically, carried away by the ice itself like time machines frozen in motion. Several missions were launched to locate the wrecks, but all failed. The ice was too thick, the equipment too primitive, and the terrain too dangerous. It wasn't until 1992, after nearly a decade of planning, that a team led by Patrick Epps and Richard Taylor successfully reached one of the P-38s. It was named Glacier Girl, but what they found shocked even them. The plane was perfectly preserved, crushed by pressure, yes, but frozen in such a way that its parts were untouched by rust or decay. Instruments, switches, cables, even the hydraulic fluid was still sealed in its lines. It was like opening a time capsule to 1942, but recovering it wasn't easy. The team had to use custom-built thermal drills to melt a vertical shaft straight down into the glacier, and then tunnel sideways to reach the fuselage. Over weeks, they extracted it piece by piece, rebuilt it over 10 years, and eventually flew it again, proving that history wasn't lost. It was just sleeping. Fast forward 3 decades. The recovery of Glacier Girl reignited interest in the lost squadron, and technology had finally caught up with ambition. By the late 2010s, a new generation of explorers equipped with drones, high-resolution ground-penetrating radar, and satellite-based glacial tracking began scanning areas around the original crash coordinates. What they discovered sent chills down their spines. Several anomalies deep within the ice showed clear, metallic outlines, some as large as a B-17, others matching the unique twin-boom shape of a P-38 Lightning. One target in particular drew attention. It matched the exact dimensions of the lead aircraft flown by Lieutenant Robert Wilson, the squadron's most experienced pilot. The site was buried more than 270 feet below the surface and nearly a mile away from the original, landing coordinates evidence of just how far the ice had carried the wreck. What followed was a meticulously planned expedition that would rival any polar exploration in recent memory. The recovery team included glaciologists, aerospace engineers, military historians, and cold weather survival experts. They spent months preparing for the extreme Arctic conditions. Supplies were airdropped. Power was generated on site. Every move was timed to avoid sudden whiteouts or deadly ice shifts. And when the drill finally broke through to the fuselage, the team paused. There was silence. No one spoke. Because inside that fuselage, preserved like the day it went down, was something no one expected. At first glance, it was just another frozen aircraft. The wings were sheared off by decades of pressure, but the cockpit remained intact. Instruments, seatbelts, and a flight jacket were still there. But then they saw the journal. A small leather-bound notebook, water-damaged but legible, wedged behind the pilot's seat. It contained flight logs, coordinates, and entries dated days after the crash, suggesting that at least one pilot may have returned to the aircraft for shelter after the initial rescue. That single notebook shattered the long-held belief that all 25 airmen were evacuated within days. It raised questions no one was ready to answer. Why would a pilot return to the plane? Was someone left behind? Did a secondary rescue mission fail? The journal hinted at distress signals, possible radio contact attempts, and at one point noted strange sounds at night, something the writer described as metal cracking beneath me. Then came the sealed rations, American military food. Packs dated 1942, never opened. A small photo of a woman, carefully tucked into the inside lining of a pilot's helmet. And then the most chilling discovery of all, what appeared to be bones, not full remains, just fragments. A jawbone, a partial hand, and a piece of uniform still bearing insignia. DNA testing is still underway, but recovery teams believe it could belong to a crew member who either stayed behind willingly or never left the aircraft to begin with. What was once a clean story of survival had become something darker, more mysterious, and more human. The team has since sealed off the site and turned over findings to military authorities and historians. Public access is restricted, but those who were there say the emotional impact was overwhelming. This wasn't just a recovery mission. It was an encounter with the past, with all its unanswered questions and frozen moments of fear, duty, and sacrifice. What shocked experts the most wasn't the preservation or the technology that made the discovery possible, it was the intimacy of it all. The small human details that survived against all odds, the handwriting in the journal, the faded photograph, the single boot tucked under the seat. These weren't artifacts. They were echoes. Whispers of young men caught in the storm of war, doing their duty, never expecting that anyone would come looking 83 years later. And yet, here we are, pulling back the ice, layer by layer, and uncovering stories that still have the power to break your heart. The wreckage is not just metal, it's memory. It's sacrifice. It's the reminder that history is never truly gone, it's just waiting, quietly, beneath the surface. After weeks of thermal drilling in the harshest conditions imaginable, operating equipment under sub-zero temperatures while analyzing cross data from radar scans and glacial movement models, the team finally made contact. At a staggering depth of approximately 320 feet below the frozen surface of Greenland, a probe hit something solid, unmistakably metallic. What appeared on the radar models was more than just wreckage. It was a nearly intact object. The shape, the symmetry, and the location aligned almost perfectly with that of AP-38 Lightning, one of the 6 legendary aircraft from the Lost Squadron. But this wasn't a fluke or a scattered debris field. The aircraft was whole, its structure still recognizable after 8 decades encased in ice. Identification began immediately, and inside the crushed but preserved fuselage, team members discovered internal tail number fragments embedded on a structural beam. Faded paint was still visible in places, barely clinging to the cold alloy, like war paint from another world. Cross-referencing those numbers against 1942 mission logs revealed what no one had dared to expect. This was Echo, the aircraft, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wilson, the squadron's lead pilot on the day of the forced landing. Echo had vanished after the crew's rescue in 1942, assumed to have been shattered or ground away by time. But here it was, sealed in ancient glacial layers suspended between geological epochs, untouched by light, sound, or history. Despite being warped and twisted by the slow, relentless movement of the ice, Echo had held together. The canopy frame was crushed inward, its wings slightly distorted from the creeping tension of glacial compression, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A twin-boom fighter locked in a silent battle with time. What stunned the recovery crew wasn't just the aircraft's presence, it was its contents. Inside the cockpit, preserved beneath the fractured glass and icy dust, were sealed canvas survival packs. Inside those, they found a flare gun, frozen but intact military rations, folded flight manuals, and even a crumbling leather jacket still slung behind the pilot's seat. Nearby, a standard-issue Colt M1911 sidearm was discovered, still in its holster, the cold metal fused slightly to its canvas sheath. But one item stood out. A storage case amazingly untouched lodged just behind the cockpit bulkhead. Inside, wrapped in waterproof materials, were handwritten notes, a flight log, and a navigator's chart marked with emergency landing zones that had never been recorded in any official mission report. It was as if Lieutenant Wilson had left behind a final message tucked away quietly in the aircraft that had once carried him across oceans of war and sky. There were no signs that anyone had returned to Echo after the initial rescue. No footsteps, no equipment, no messages scratched into the interior. It had remained frozen and undisturbed for 83 years, its own solemn, suspended world of metal, ice, and memory. The plane itself, though severely compressed, was a marvel of preservation. There were no visible signs of impact damage, no evidence of nose first crashes or ruptured fuselage. The landing gear hadn't even deployed, supporting Wilson's original 1942 report that the emergency landing had been controlled and deliberate. This was not a wreck born of destruction. It was a precision descent into the unknown, dictated by weather and fuel, not by mechanical failure or enemy fire. The engine's twin Allison V1710s were still locked in place, both frozen solid, their inner components sealed by pressure and ice. And perhaps most remarkably, the interior was oxygen-starved, which had prevented the usual organic decay that wreckage often suffers even in frigid climates. According to early technician reports, even the paper inside the sealed bag had avoided moisture damage. The condition of the contents shocked both scientists and historians. This wasn't just an aircraft recovery, it was an encounter with the past, perfectly preserved, down to the fibers and rust marks. It offered an unprecedented opportunity to study World War II aviation not as it exists in museums or blueprints, but exactly as it was when it flew its final mission. And yet, this frozen time capsule now posed an extraordinary challenge. How do you extract history from a glacier without destroying it? The answer lay in the next phase of the mission, recovery. This was not a simple operation of dig and lift. Removing Echo from the depths of the Greenland ice sheet required the scale, coordination, and precision of a military deployment. The operation had to be timed perfectly within the narrow summer window, just 8 to 10 weeks of relative weather stability. A logistics base was set up about half a mile from the site on what glaciologists deemed stable ground. Every inch of equipment had to be brought in by air-heated tents. Fuel drums, communication systems, backup generators, medical facilities, and food supplies. Machinery had to be Arctic hardened, able to function in temperatures below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, where even steel becomes brittle and batteries freeze within minutes. The lead engineer, Michael Travers, was a veteran of previous Arctic drilling projects and had one non-negotiable demand: no open-pit excavation. Instead, the team would use custom thermal drill rigs to melt a vertical shaft directly above the wreckage. This would minimize the risk of collapse and protect the aircraft from sudden pressure shifts. Water generated during melting would be pumped out constantly to prevent it from refreezing and damaging structural components. Once the ice had been cleared to the top of the fuselage, the work became surgical. Expandable support braces were lowered around the aircraft, locking into the surrounding ice to prevent cave-ins. Each section of the plane wings, tail, fuselage, engines was carefully assessed, braced, and cut loose from the glacier using thermal tools and vibration-reducing saws. The goal wasn't speed, it was precision. The slightest vibration could trigger stress fractures or shatter frozen glass. As each part was freed, it was wrapped in multiple layers of insulation, sealed in vacuum-protective film, and slowly hoisted to the surface using pulley-assisted cranes. But the glacier wasn't going to wait patiently. Whiteouts came fast and often, trapping crews in their shelters for days. Warmer than expected winds in early July began melting surface ice faster than anticipated, creating dangerous shifts in pressure inside the shaft. One crack near the western support almost forced a full evacuation. And looming over everything was the unpredictable threat of wildlife. Shifting prey patterns had driven polar bears farther inland, and though rare, a sighting near the outer camp perimeter prompted round-the-clock armed wildlife patrols. Safety was a constant calculation. Every hour on the ice required weather updates, medical drills, and rapid evac plans on standby. When the final piece of Echo was lifted out and secured for air transport, the team didn't celebrate with cheers. It was quiet, almost reverent. The mission wasn't over. It had simply moved to a new stage. Echo was airlifted from Greenland and flown, under climate-controlled conditions, to a specialized preservation facility in the U.S. There, the recovery transformed into analysis. Technicians began the painstaking process of thawing each component knot, rapidly, but over days and weeks to avoid expansion damage. The cockpit, still frosted over when it arrived, was gradually brought to safe temperature and opened under controlled humidity. Personal effects were cataloged: the flight jacket, the emergency rations, the flare gun, the navigator's chart. Historians and engineers gathered to study every detail. Chemical tests were run on the oil. Fiber samples were taken from the uniform. The results pointed to a unique microclimate around the aircraft: oxygen-poor, moisture-sealed, and temperature-stable conditions. That had essentially frozen time. Instruments from the control panel were digitized, scanned in high resolution, and added to a virtual 3D model, allowing museums and researchers to experience Echo's cockpit exactly as it appeared in 1942. The level of preservation stunned everyone involved. For many, this was no longer just about a plane. It was a conversation with history. The response across the country was immediate. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force submitted a request to exhibit Echo in its current unrestored state, still twisted and weathered from the glacier, but undeniably real. Other voices called for full restoration, like the one completed with Glacier Girl decades earlier. The debate was passionate. Should history be polished and restored, or displayed with all its scars intact? Meanwhile, for the family of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wilson, the news was deeply personal. They had known his story from letters and wartime records. But to see his aircraft, his seat, his flight gear, the notes he may have written in that final moment brought tears and silence. A private viewing was arranged at the facility, where close relatives and military officials gathered to witness the return of a long-lost chapter in their family's history. No press, no cameras. Just remembrance, but even with Echo recovered, the mission was far from over. 5 more P-38s and 2 B-17 bombers from the lost squadron are still unaccounted for, hidden somewhere beneath the ever-moving Greenland ice. Radar data from the Echo mission revealed at least 3 more anomaly shapes and depths consistent with aircraft. Planning is already underway for a multi-year operation using the same precision tools and techniques to excavate them. Parallel efforts are also reigniting interest in another downed plane, the Grumman J-2F Duck, lost in the same storm that grounded the Lost Squadron in 1942. That aircraft carried 3 Coast Guard crewmen. Their bodies were never recovered. Now, with proven technology and a renewed sense of purpose, the search will continue. Because Echo proved something the world had only guessed at before, that time does not erase everything. In the right conditions, it preserves. And sometimes when we're willing to listen, it speaks.